A customer walks into a restaurant wearing a MAGA hat, ready to enjoy a meal. But when the waiter spots the hat, something unexpected happens. What follows is a shocking twist that leaves everyone stunned. Keep watching to find out what happens next. The restaurant buzzed with the familiar sounds of clinking glasses, muffled chatter, and the occasional laugh that rippled through the crowded dining room. It was a Saturday lunch rush, and every table was occupied. Waiters weaved expertly between tables, their trays balanced precariously with drinks, entrees, and desserts. In the middle of it all was David, a young waiter in his mid-20s, hustling through his shift. The monotony of taking orders and delivering plates kept him distracted from the ache-in, his feet, and the long hours ahead. David had been working at the restaurant for over a year. It wasn't his dream job, but it paid the bills while he figured out what he wanted to do with his life. He was known for his quick wit and charm with customers, traits that earned him decent tips. But today, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that even the sound of the restaurant's upbeat playlist couldn't dispel. As David dropped off a pitcher of water at table 7, he noticed a man walking through the front door. The host greeted him warmly and led him to an empty table in the corner. David wouldn't have paid much attention, but the man's bright red MAGA hat immediately caught his eye. It stood out starkly against the sea of neutral tones in the restaurant. The man, in his late 40s or early 50s, wore the hat confidently. He had a friendly demeanor, nodding politely to the host and scanning the menu as he sat down. Dressed casually in a button-down shirt and jeans, it looked like any other diner, except for the hat. To David, though, that hat wasn't just an accessory, it was a statement. As soon as David saw the hat, his chest tightened. Memories of heated arguments and polarizing news stories flashed through his mind. To him, the hat represented division, conflict, and values he didn't align with. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off his growing frustration. He turned to Amy, a fellow server, who was refilling coffee at the station. "Did you see the guy who just walked in?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Amy glanced toward the corner table and raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, what about him?" David motioned toward the hat. "You see what he's wearing?" Amy rolled her eyes. "It's just a hat, David. Let it go." David frowned. "It's not just a hat. You know what that stands for?" Amy shrugged, her focus already shifting back to her work. "It's a busy shift. Just take his order and move on." But David couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. He felt torn between his personal convictions and his professional obligation. Part of him wanted to confront the man, to ask why he would wear something so provocative in a public place. But another part of him knew it wasn't his place to challenge a customer. Still, the thought of serving someone like that gnawed at him. David glanced around the dining room, searching for someone to pass the table off to. Most of the servers were already swamped with orders, their faces flushed from the heat of the kitchen and the pressure of the lunch rush. Amy caught his eye and shook her head, as if to say, "Don't even think about it." Left with no other option, David grabbed his notepad and reluctantly approached the table. The man looked up as David neared, offering a polite smile. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice warm. "How's it going?" David forced a smile. "Fine. Can I get you started with something to drink?" The man nodded. "Just water for now. Thanks. I'll need a minute with the menu." David scribbled the order down and turned to leave, but something stopped him. His frustration bubbled to the surface, and before he could stop himself, he blurted out, "You know, that hat's pretty bold to wear in a place like this." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but curious. "Is it?" he asked, his tone neutral. David felt a surge of adrenaline. "Yep, not everyone's a fan of what that stands for." "Just saying." For a moment, the man said nothing, his gaze steady. Then he leaned back slightly, nodding as if considering David's words. "Well, I appreciate your honesty," he said simply. The response caught David off guard. He had expected defensiveness or anger, but the man's calm demeanor disarmed him. Unsure of how to respond, David mumbled, "I'll get your water," and quickly walked away. Back at the server station, David relayed the interaction to Amy, his voice low but charged with emotion. "Can you believe that guy? He just sat there like it's no big deal." Amy sighed. "David, you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. He's a customer. Just do your job." "But it is a big deal." David insisted. "I don't want to serve someone who flaunts that kind of message." Amy shot him a warning look. You're not the one who gets to decide that. You don't know anything about him. David crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. I know enough. As the shift wore on, David continued to avoid the man's table, hoping another server would pick it up. But as the restaurant grew busier, it became clear that no one else had the time. Susan, the manager, eventually noticed that the man's table hadn't been attended to. David, table 12 needs service, she said, her tone firm. Why is no one helping him? David hesitated. I can't serve him. Susan's brow furrowed. What do you mean you can't? David gestured toward the table. Look at what he's wearing. I don't feel comfortable serving someone like that. Susan's expression darkened. David, he's a paying customer. Your personal feelings don't give you the right to refuse service. But David began, but Susan cut him off. No buts. Either serve him or I'll do it myself. Reluctantly, David grabbed his notepad and returned to the table. The man, still calm, looked up as David approached. Ready to order? David asked. His tone clipped. The man nodded, placing the menu down. I'll have the grilled salmon, please. And thank you. David scribbled the order without meeting the man's gaze, then hurried back to the kitchen. As he handed the ticket to the chef, he felt a mix of anger and guilt swirling in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that this man's presence had thrown his entire day off balance. As the man's meal progressed, David continued to deliver his order and refill his water with minimal interaction. Each time he approached the table, he felt the weight of the man's calm demeanor. It wasn't confrontational, but it wasn't indifferent either. It was as if the man saw right through David's hostility and chose not to engage with it. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate among the staff. Other servers had noticed David's reaction to the man and were speculating about what had happened. Some sympathized with David, while others thought he was overreacting. I mean, it's just a hat, one server said. What's the big deal? It's not just a hat, another countered. It's a statement. Amid the whispers, David felt increasingly isolated. He couldn't understand how everyone else could be so neutral about something that felt so charged to him. As the man finished his meal, he pulled out a small notebook and began jotting down notes. David noticed this from a distance and felt his frustration flare again. What's he doing now? He muttered to himself. Writing a Yelp review? The man paid his bill and left a generous tip before quietly exiting the restaurant. David watched him go, a mixture of relief and lingering anger swirling in his chest. Little did he know, this wasn't the last he'd see of the man or the last time. The encounter would force him to confront his own biases. The next day at the restaurant started much like any other. The soft clatter of dishes, the warm hum of conversation, and the smell of fresh coffee greeted David as he clocked in. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind, but he pushed them aside, convincing himself he'd done what he thought was right. To him, that man and his red MAGA had represented values he couldn't align with, and he believed he had stood his ground. But something felt different in the air. David couldn't quite place it, but there was a quiet tension among the staff. Servers whispered in the corners, casting occasional glances toward the manager's office. Even Amy, who was usually lighthearted and unbothered, seemed unusually quiet. About an hour into the shift, Susan, the manager, called an impromptu meeting in the back office. The team shuffled in, murmuring amongst themselves. David leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, already bracing himself for what he assumed would be another lecture about teamwork or time management. Susan stood at the front of the room, her usual composed demeanor replaced with a hint of unease. She cleared her throat, silencing the chatter. I wanted to address something important, she began. Her tone was measured, but firm. Yesterday, one of our customers had an interaction with a staff member that raised some concerns. David's stomach dropped. He glanced around the room, but no one looked directly at him. He knew where this was going. Susan continued, her eyes scanning the group. The man who was here yesterday, the one wearing the MAGA hat, he wasn't just another customer. He's the owner of this restaurant. The room erupted in whispers. David felt his heart slam into his chest as the weight of her words sank in. The man, the one he had refused to serve, the one he had judged so harshly, owned the very place where he worked. Susan held up her hand to quiet the group. He was here to observe the staff and see how things were running. Overall, he was impressed with the restaurant and the team's performance. But she paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. He specifically noted that one of our servers refused to serve him. He said it was disappointing and went against the values this restaurant stands for. David's face flushed. His mind raced as he replayed the interaction from the day before. The man's calm demeanor, his polite tone had all clashed with the assumptions David had made. Shame began to creep in, but he masked it with defensiveness. "I didn't know he was the owner," David blurted out, his voice cutting through the silence. All eyes turned to him, some filled with surprise, others with quiet judgment. "That doesn't matter," Susan said, her tone sharp. "Whether he's the owner or not, he's a customer. And as I've told you before, personal feelings cannot dictate how we treat the people who walk through those doors." David clenched his fists, his voice rising slightly. "But you saw what he was wearing. That hat, what it stands for, it's offensive to me. I didn't want to serve him because I don't agree with what he represents." Susan's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "I understand that you have your own beliefs, David. We all do. But this isn't about agreeing or disagreeing. This is about professionalism, about respect. This restaurant is supposed to be a place where everyone feels welcome." David opened his mouth to argue, but Susan held up her hand. "He didn't file a formal complaint," she said. "He doesn't want anyone fired, but he did want us to have this conversation. He wanted us to think about what it means to judge someone without truly knowing them." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. David couldn't meet anyone's gaze. He felt exposed, his actions laid bare for all to see. After the meeting, David stayed behind, sitting alone in the empty dining room. The sound of the kitchen in the background felt distant, muffled by the noise in his own head. He replayed the man's expression from the day before, not angry, not defensive, but calm, almost understanding. The memory of the man quietly leaving a generous tip, despite how he had been treated, twisted David's guilt even further. Amy approached him, her steps hesitant. "Hey," she said softly, sitting down across from him. "You okay?" David shook his head. "I screwed up, didn't I?" Amy didn't answer right away. Instead, she folded her hands on the table, her expression thoughtful. "I think you let your feelings get the best of you. But honestly, David, I don't think you're a bad person. You just made a mistake." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I judged him before I even spoke to him. I thought I knew everything about him because of that hat. But now, I don't know. Maybe I was wrong." Amy smiled faintly. "The fact that you're even saying that means something. You're trying to see it differently. That's a good start." Over the next few days, David worked his shifts with a newfound awareness. He began paying closer attention to the customers he served, not just their orders, but their body language, their expressions, the little details that made them human. He realized how often he had made snap judgments about people without truly understanding them. One afternoon, as David cleared a table near the window, he overheard a conversation between two customers. They were discussing a local charity event the restaurant had supported a project to feed homeless families in the area. "I heard the owner started the whole thing," one of them said. "He's been quietly funding it for years. Doesn't even want the credit." David froze, his hand gripping a dirty plate. The owner, the man in the red hat. He had never imagined that someone wearing a symbol he associated with division could also be someone dedicated to helping others. A week later, the owner returned. This time, he wasn't wearing the hat. He entered the restaurant quietly, greeting Susan at the door before taking a seat at the same corner table. When David saw him, his heart raced. He knew this was his chance to make things right. "David," Susan called, gesturing for him to come over. "I think you should handle this table." David hesitated, but he nodded. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his notepad and approached the man. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, his voice steady but nervous. "Welcome back." The man looked up, a faint smile on his face. "Thank you, David. Good to see you again." David shifted uncomfortably. "Before we get started, I just want to say, I'm sorry for how I treated you last time. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "It's not easy to admit when we've made a mistake. I respect that you did." David felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but he knew the conversation wasn't over. "I judged you because of your hat," he admitted. "But I've realized that I didn't know anything about you. I just assumed. The man smiled again, this time with a hint of warmth. It's easy to make assumptions. We all do it. But what matters is what we do once we realize we've been wrong. As the meal progressed, David found himself talking to the man more openly. He learned about the owner's dedication to the community, his belief in creating spaces where people from all walks of life could come together. David listened intently, his perspective shifting with every word. By the time the man left, David felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced before. The encounter wasn't just a lesson in professionalism, it was a lesson in empathy, in looking beyond the surface to see the person underneath. The restaurant hummed with its usual lunch crowd as David worked through his shift. But today, everything felt different. The owner's calm demeanor during their last interaction had stayed with him, replaying in his mind like an unsolved riddle. David's usual confidence had been replaced with quiet introspection. He couldn't shake the feeling that his assumptions about the man in the MAGA had blinded him to something deeper. It was mid-afternoon when the owner walked into the restaurant again. This time, he wasn't wearing the red hat, and his presence was more subdued. Dressed in a simple blazer and dark jeans, he carried himself with the same calm confidence, nodding politely to the host before taking a seat at the same corner table. David spotted him immediately, and his chest tightened. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. The owner's visits weren't about dining, they were about observing. David took a deep breath, adjusted his apron, and approached the table with a cautious smile. "Welcome back, sir," David said, his voice steady but hesitant. "Can I get you started with anything?" The owner smiled faintly, glancing at David's name tag. "David, isn't it?" he asked. "Yes, sir," David replied, surprised that he remembered. "I'll just have coffee for now," the owner said, his tone warm. "And I'd like to chat with you when you have a moment." David nodded, his nerves spiking. "Of course, I'll be right back." As he walked toward the coffee station, David felt a wave of unease. What did the owner want to talk about? Was this a test? An opportunity? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to face it head on. When David returned with the coffee, the owner gestured for him to sit down. It wasn't a request, it was an invitation. "Take a seat, David," the owner said. "I'd like to get to know you better." David hesitated but complied, folding his hands nervously in his lap. The owner took a sip of his coffee before speaking. "You've been working here for a while, haven't you?" he asked. "Yes, sir. About a year and a half," David replied, his voice cautious. "And how do you like it?" the owner asked. David shrugged. "It's a good job. The team's great, and the customers, well, most of them are easy to handle." The owner chuckled softly, his gaze steady. "Most of them? Huh? What about the ones who aren't?" David stiffened, sensing where the conversation was headed. "I tried to be professional," he said carefully. "But sometimes it's hard to separate personal feelings from the job." The owner nodded, as if he understood. "I noticed that the last time I was here," he said, "you had strong feelings about me before we even spoke." David swallowed hard, his face flushing. "I did, and I was wrong. I let it cloud my judgment." The owner leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Do you know why I wore that hat, David?" David shook his head. "I assumed it was because of what it stands for." The owner nodded slowly. "It does stand for something for me. It represents resilience. It reminds me of my brother, who always believed in standing firm for what he believed in, even when it wasn't popular." David blinked, caught off guard by the personal revelation. "Your brother?" he asked softly. "Yes," the owner said, his voice tinged with emotion. "He passed away a few years ago. That hat was his favorite. I wear it sometimes to honor him, not to provoke anyone, but as a reminder of his courage." David's stomach sank. All his assumptions, his anger, they felt so misplaced now. He had seen the hat as a symbol of division, but to the owner, it was something entirely different, a personal connection, a tribute. The owner continued, his tone steady but reflective. "You see, David, people are more than what they wear or the labels they choose. We all carry stories, some visible, some hidden. But if we judge each other too quickly, we miss the chance to truly understand." David felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't take the time to see the person behind the hat. I just assumed." The owner smiled gently. "It's a lesson we all learn at some point. The important thing is what we do with that understanding." David nodded, feeling a mix of shame and gratitude. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn." The owner leaned forward slightly, his expression kind but firm. "You have potential, David. I can see it. But potential means nothing without growth. This restaurant is more than a place to serve food. It's a place where people come to feel welcome. That includes everyone, no matter who they are or what they believe." Later that evening, the owner called a staff meeting. The entire team gathered in the dining room. Curious about the unexpected announcement, David stood near the back, still processing the earlier conversation. The owner addressed the group with a calm authority that immediately commanded attention. "First, I want to thank all of you for the hard work you put into making this restaurant what it is," he began. "But today, I want to talk about something more important than food or service. I want to talk about respect." The room fell silent as he continued. This restaurant was built on the idea that people from all walks of life can come together, share a meal, and leave feeling better than when they came in. But that only works if we, as a team, create an environment where everyone feels welcome. He paused, letting the words sink in. It's easy to make assumptions about people. We all do it. But if we let those assumptions dictate our actions, we risk alienating the very people we're here to serve. David felt the words hit him like a wave. The owner wasn't just talking about customers, he was talking about him. After the meeting, David stayed behind, sitting alone at one of the tables. Amy joined him, her expression unreadable. "That was powerful," she said, breaking the silence. David nodded. "Yeah, it was." Amy studied him for a moment. "You okay?" David sighed. "I'm trying to be. I've had a lot to think about." She smiled faintly. "Well, if it helps, I think you've already taken the hardest step." "What's that?" David asked. "Admitting you were wrong," Amy said simply. "Not everyone can do that." David nodded, feeling a small glimmer of hope. He wasn't perfect, but he was learning. And that, he realized, was a start. The restaurant's usual hum filled the air, clinking glasses, laughter, and the occasional shout from the kitchen. But for David, everything seemed quieter, heavier. The owner's words from the staff meeting echoed in his mind, not just as a critique, but as a challenge. It wasn't just about what he had done wrong, it was about who he wanted to become. 2 days after the meeting, the owner returned to the restaurant. This time, he arrived during a slower shift, just after the lunch rush. David spotted him as soon as he walked in. His heart raced. But this time, it wasn't from frustration or defiance, it was from a desire to prove that he could do better. The owner chose the same corner table and settled in, casually scanning the menu. David took a deep breath, grabbed his notepad, and approached the table. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, his voice steady. "It's nice to see you again. Can I get you started with something to drink?" The owner looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "David, good to see you, too. I'll just have water, please." David nodded and returned quickly with the drink, trying to keep his hands from shaking as he set it down. "Do you need more time with the menu?" he asked. The owner shook his head. "I think I'll go with the chicken Caesar salad today." "Thank you." As David wrote down the order, the owner's calm demeanor helped ease his nerves. This wasn't a test, at least. Not the kind he'd feared. It felt more like an opportunity. Throughout the meal, David went out of his way to ensure the owner had a good experience. He refilled his water before being asked, checked on his meal at just the right moments, and even offered a quiet smile when he brought the check. The owner noticed, of course. When David returned to clear the plates, the owner spoke up. "You've been very attentive today," he said, his tone warm. "I appreciate that." David felt his cheeks flush. "Thank you, sir. I've been trying to be better." The owner tilted his head slightly, studying David. "And what have you learned so far?" David hesitated, but the words came out naturally. That it's easy to judge people without really knowing them, and that I don't want to be the kind of person who does that anymore. The owner's smile widened, and he nodded. "That's a good start, David." Later that day, Susan pulled David aside. She was holding a small envelope with the restaurant's logo stamped on the front. "The owner left this for you," she said, handing it to him. David's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a note written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Asterisk David. "Growth isn't always easy, but it's necessary. I see potential in you not just as an employee, but as a leader. I'd like to offer you a chance to grow further by taking on a mentorship program I've created for our team. It focuses on building empathy, understanding, and strong customer relationships. If you're interested, let me know. J. Parker *. David stared at the note, his heart pounding. The idea of a mentorship program intrigued him, but it also terrified him. Could he really take on something like that? Could he lead by example when he'd already made such a public mistake? Over the next week, David began shadowing Susan as part of the mentorship program. The experience was eye-opening. Susan walked him through the nuances of managing a team, handling difficult customers, and creating a positive work environment. But the most impactful moments came during her quiet conversations with the staff. One day, as they stood near the server station, Susan pointed out a young waiter struggling to balance a heavy tray. She stepped in to help, offering advice with a calm, encouraging tone. Later, she explained her approach to David. Leadership isn't about being perfect, she said. It's about being present. People will forgive your mistakes if they see that you're trying to improve and that you genuinely care. Her words resonated deeply with David, he thought. Back to his interactions with the owner. The calm way he had handled the situation, his willingness to forgive, and his insistence on seeing potential where David had only seen conflict. For the first time, David began to see leadership as more than just giving orders. It was about building trust. During one of David's shifts, a new customer walked into the restaurant, a middle-aged man wearing a MAGA hat. David froze for a moment, his instincts clashing with his newfound understanding. But instead of reacting with judgment, he took a deep breath and approached the table with the same professionalism he'd shown the owner. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, offering a polite smile. "Welcome to our restaurant. Can I get you started with something to drink?" The man looked up, surprised by David's warmth. "Just a Coke, please," he said, his tone tentative. As the meal progressed, David treated the man with the same attentiveness he gave every other customer. By the end of the meal, the man seemed visibly relaxed, even offering David a kind word as he paid his bill. "Thanks for the great service," he said. "It's nice to feel welcome." David smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad you enjoyed your visit." As the man left, David felt a sense of closure. He had faced the very situation that had once brought out the worst in him, and this time, he had risen to the occasion. Later that week, the owner invited David to his office for a one-on-one conversation. The room was modest but inviting, with framed photos of the restaurant's early days adorning the walls. "David, I've been watching your progress," the owner said, gesturing for him to sit. "And I have to say, I'm impressed." David felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I've been trying to learn from my mistakes." The owner nodded. "That's all anyone can ask for. But tell me, what do you think has been the biggest lesson for you?" David thought for a moment before answering. That people are more than what we see on the surface, and that judgment only gets in the way of connection. The owner smiled. "Exactly. And that's what this restaurant is all about, connection. It's not just about the food or the service. It's about creating a space where everyone feels valued." David left the office that day with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just working at the restaurant anymore, he was part of something bigger, something meaningful. By the end of the month, David had fully embraced his role in the mentorship program. He found himself coaching newer servers, helping them navigate difficult situations with patience and empathy. His colleagues noticed the change, and even Amy admitted she was impressed. "You've come a long way, David," she said one evening as they closed up the restaurant. "I barely recognize you." David smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. "I guess I had some good teachers." The restaurant buzzed with its usual energy. But for David, today held a special significance. It marked 1 year since the pivotal encounter with the owner, the man in the red MAGA hat that had transformed his perspective and approach to life. As he moved through the familiar space, greeting regulars and newcomers alike, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Over the past year, David had fully embraced the mentorship program initiated by the owner, Mr. Parker. He had evolved from a server who once let personal biases cloud his judgment into a leader who championed empathy and understanding. His colleagues often sought his advice, and he took pride in fostering an inclusive environment where both staff and patrons felt valued. One afternoon, as David was training a new hire, Amy approached him with a grin. "Guess who just made Employee of the Month?" she said, holding up a certificate. David's eyes widened in surprise. "Seriously? That's amazing." Amy handed him the certificate. "You've earned it, David. You've come a long way." He looked at the certificate, a sense of accomplishment washing over him. "Thanks, Amy. Couldn't have done it without the support of the team." Later that week, Mr. Parker visited the restaurant. This time, his presence felt less like an evaluation and more like a reunion. He observed the bustling dining room, noting the camaraderie among the staff and the satisfaction of the customers. When he caught David's eye, he offered a nod of approval. During a quiet moment, Mr. Parker called David over to his table. "David, it's good to see you," he said warmly. "Good to see you too, Mr. Parker," David replied, taking a seat as invited. Mr. Parker leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I've been impressed with the changes you've implemented here. The atmosphere is welcoming, and the team seems more cohesive than ever." David smiled. "Thank you, sir. I've learned a lot from the mentorship program and from observing how you lead." Mr. Parker nodded. "Leadership is about more than giving orders. It's about inspiring others to be their best selves. You've embodied that principle well." David felt a swell of pride. "I appreciate that, Mr. Parker. It's been a transformative experience." As their conversation continued, Mr. Parker's tone shifted to a more serious note. "David, I have a proposition for you," he began. "I'm planning to open a new restaurant across town, and I need someone to manage it. Someone who understands our values and can cultivate the right environment from the ground up." David's heart skipped a beat. "Are you offering me the position?" Mr. Parker smiled. "I am. You've demonstrated remarkable growth and leadership. I believe you're ready for this next step." The weight of the offer settled over David. It was an incredible opportunity, but it also meant leaving the team he had grown so close to. I'm honored, Mr. Parker. This is a big decision. Can I have some time to think it over?" "Of course," Mr. Parker replied. "Take all the time you need. Just know that I have confidence in your abilities, whatever you decide." That evening, David sat with Amy after closing time, sharing the news. "Wow, David, that's huge," Amy exclaimed. "Managing a new restaurant? That's like a dream come true." "It is," David agreed. "But it also means leaving here, leaving all of you." Amy placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Change is hard, but think about the impact you could have. You've transformed this place. Imagine what you could do with a new team, a fresh start." David nodded, her words resonating with his own thoughts. "You're right. It's an opportunity to take everything I've learned it and apply it on a larger scale. And we'll always be here to support you," Amy added. "No matter where you go, you're part of this family." After a weekend of reflection, David met with Mr. Parker to give his answer. "Mr. Parker, I've thought a lot about your offer," he began. "I'm grateful for the opportunity and for the faith you've shown in me. After careful consideration, I've decided to accept the position." Mr. Parker's face broke into a broad smile. "That's wonderful news. David, I have no doubt that you'll excel in this new role." "Thank you, sir," David replied. "I'm excited to get started and to build a team that reflects the values we've cultivated here." "I have every confidence that you will," Mr. Parker said. "Let's discuss the next steps and how we can ensure a smooth transition." In the weeks that followed, David prepared to take on his new role. He worked closely with Susan and the rest of the team to ensure that his departure wouldn't disrupt the restaurant's operations. On his final day, the staff organized a small farewell gathering, sharing memories and expressing their gratitude for his leadership. As he looked around at the faces of his colleagues, his friends, David felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey from a judgmental server to a respected leader had been challenging, but it had also been profoundly rewarding. "Thank you all," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "This isn't goodbye. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. I carry with me everything we've built together, and I look forward to seeing what the future holds for all of us." As the applause filled the room, David felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The journey from a judgmental server to a respected leader had been challenging, but it had also been profoundly rewarding. The following week, David began his role as the manager of the new restaurant. The space was modern and inviting, with an open floor plan that encouraged interaction between staff and guests. David's vision was clear: to create an environment where everyone felt welcome, respected, and valued. He started by assembling a diverse team, carefully selecting individuals who brought unique perspectives and experiences. During the training sessions, David emphasized the importance of empathy, open-mindedness, and the restaurant's core values. Our goal is to serve excellent food. Yes, he told his team, but more importantly, we aim to create a community. Every person who walks through our doors should feel like they belong here. The team responded with enthusiasm, embracing David's inclusive approach. As the opening day approached, there was a palpable sense of excitement and unity among the staff. The grand opening was a resounding success. The restaurant was filled with patrons from all walks of life, and the atmosphere buzzed with laughter and conversation. David moved through the room, greeting guests, assisting his team, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. At one point, he noticed a man sitting alone at a table near the window, wearing a red MAGA hat. A year ago, such a sight might have triggered a negative reaction in David, but now he saw an opportunity to connect. He approached the man with a warm smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to our restaurant. I'm David, the manager here. Is there anything I can do to make your visit more enjoyable?" The man looked up, surprised by the personal attention. "Thank you, David. I'm just enjoying the atmosphere. It's a lovely place you have here." David engaged him in conversation, learning about his interests and background. They discussed various topics, finding common ground despite any differences. By the end of the evening, the man expressed his appreciation for the genuine hospitality. "I'll definitely be coming back," he said, shaking David's hand. "We look forward to it," David replied sincerely. That night, after the last guest had departed and the staff was cleaning up, David took a moment to reflect. The transformation he had undergone was mirrored in the success of the new restaurant. By embracing empathy and rejecting judgment, he had fostered a space where diversity was celebrated and connections were forged. Amy had been right. Change was hard, but it was also necessary for growth. David realized that the lessons he had learned were not just about managing a restaurant, but about leading a life filled with understanding and compassion. As he turned off the lights and locked the doors, David felt a deep sense of peace. The journey was ongoing, but he was ready for whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that true leadership begins with an open heart and an open mind.